So in object-oriented programming, you typically create this blueprint with properties and methods called the class, and based on the class you are able to create objects. Now each object derived from a class will have a similar structure, but their values might be different. For instance, you and I are both derived from a person class, and each of us is going to have a walk method, a talk method, and also an eat method. There are properties like name, age, or gender which may or may not be the same for both of us. And by the way, if you want to know more about JavaScript classes and what really happens behind the scenes, you can check out my previous video. So in this example here, if you take a look at the methods eat, walk, and talk, you can see that the console log starts with this.name and then the actual action. In case of eat, it's going to be this.name is eating, and so on for the rest of the methods. Now, this keyword here refers to an instance of the class, or in other words, an object that is created out of this class. So as you can see here, we have 3 objects created out of this person class. When you create an object from a class using the new keyword, it calls the constructor function and creates a new object with the properties passed inside the parameters. So the properties here that we have passed for each object, it's basically passed inside the constructor function, and a new object instance is created out of this class. So now we have 3 different objects with the same structure but with different values. Now if we try to run the eat method on the John object, this keyword will point to the instance of the class, which in this case is the object itself. So this .name will look more like John object.name, and the name property of John object is set to this string here, John in capital. So we get John is eating as the output. If I try to run this, you can see that John is eating is what gets printed. So in short, this keyword represents the instance of a class. And yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Obviously, that's not the end of it. This is JavaScript and we like to spice things up a little bit over here. So yes, some part of the previous statement is correct. This does represent an instance of a class, but there's more to it. This keyword behaves differently in different scenarios, and we'll take a look at most of them in this video. The very first scenario that you'll commonly come across is going to be the global context. So in global context, and by global context I mean anywhere outside a function unless it's not a nested function. So in this context, this will always refer to the window object. If I just comment this out for now and instead console log this expression, this should ideally return true. So if I save this, and yeah, you can see that it returns true, because as I mentioned, in the global context, this keyword will always refer to the window object. So inside a function context, things start to get a little bit tricky. The value of this inside a function will depend upon how the function is being called. So if a function is a method, which means that it's part of an object, then this will refer to the object calling the method, just like we saw in the introduction. So in this case, we have this object over here with a method called walk, and this method is trying to refer to the name property using the this keyword, and since it's a method, this here will refer to the person object itself. So this .name basically means the person.name property, and person.name is John, so the output here will be John walking. So if I go and check inside the browser, you'll see that you get John walking as expected. Now instead of a method, if you have a simple function, then by default this will be set to the window object. So inside this function here, if I try to return the this keyword and see what it points to, you'll find that this keyword is pointing to the window object. So this statement here should return true. If I save this and I go back to my browser, I'll need to console log this first. Now if I go back and see, yeah, I get true. So this does mean that this keyword inside a regular function by default points to the window object. If you run the same test function in strict mode, the value of this keyword will be set to undefined. So if I just add strict mode here inside the function, and now I try to see if this points to the window object or not, I will get the value of this statement as false. So yeah, you can see that it gives me false. If I simply try to console log the value of this over here, it should be undefined. So inside a regular function in strict mode, the value of this is undefined, and if you don't have strict mode here, the value of this will be the window object. The reason why it returns undefined is because the function was called directly and not as property of an object, which in this case is the window object. Since it's being run in strict mode, you need the object on which the method is being called to be perfectly mapped to the context. So while test.window may return false, if I just simply change the value of test to window.test, now I should get true. You can see that the statement now gives me true. So basically inside strict mode, it's just trying to see if the way you are calling the method complies with the rules inside the strict mode. So if the function was not using strict mode, you could have called it directly and it would have still worked. But if you are using strict mode, then you need to call it properly by calling the method as the property of an object. The behavior of this keyword inside a class is almost similar to that of a function, since classes are essentially functions under the hood. Within a class constructor, the value of this will be the instance that gets created using the class, as we had discussed earlier. So whenever I try to create an instance from this employee function or class, this doesn't really look like a class, but essentially whenever you create a class, this function is basically the constructor function inside the class. So it's ultimately going to give you the same result. So whenever you try to create a new object using the new keyword from the class, it will return an object with all the default properties. So the properties that I'm passing in here, which is the name property, an object will be created with this property attached to that object. But what happens if I try to call the same function without the new keyword? Now the problem is, whenever you try to run this function without the new keyword here, the JavaScript engine is not able to find the new keyword, and so what it does is it sets the value of this to the default object, which is the window object. Only when you use the new keyword, it creates a new object and sets the value of this to that particular object. So if I would have done this, the value of this would be E1, the object instance. But if I remove the new keyword now, the value of this will be set to the window object. And I can prove this by simply console logging the window object now. So what should happen now is, instead of this name property being attached to the object instance, you will find this name property attached to the window object. So if I save this and go back to my browser, you will see the window object here, and there should be a name property somewhere. Yeah, you can see that the name property is attached to the window object. So basically, whenever you try to call this function or the class without the new keyword, it sets the value of this to the default object, which is the window object. Now this keyword inside an arrow function refers to the lexical scope that contains the function. So what do I mean by this? So if you try to create an arrow function inside the global scope, this will always be set to the global object because the arrow function is part of the global scope. You can consider the global scope also to be a function which contains all the things inside your script. So the arrow function is part of the global scope, and since it's part of the global scope and since it's an arrow function, this here inside the arrow function will always refer to the window object. So if I try to call this arrow function and see if it's equal to the global object which is set to this, which is the window object, I can console log it below here. So I should get the console log first, which is the window object, and then I should get true, because inside arrow function this refers to the window object. Again, I need to call this. So yeah, I get the window object and I also get true. If you take a look at this object over here, we have a property and we have a method. Now inside this method, I have used an arrow function. So since it's an arrow function, it will look at the scope that this function is a part of. So the function here is part of this scope here. You cannot find any other function inside which this object is present. This object exists inside the global scope. So when you try to run this method on this object, which we are doing over here, it will try to look for the context, which is this. And since it's an arrow function, it will look at the scope enclosing it. So the scope enclosing this method is the global scope, because the object is not part of any other function. It's directly part of the global scope. So this console log here will ultimately return the window object, which you can see over here. Now, instead of an arrow function, if I just simply replace this with a regular function, now I'll get the object here, because when I use a normal function, not an arrow function, that this inside a regular function will refer to the object instance. So if I try to run this object.method and I try to console log this inside this method, it will point to the whole object. So yeah, I do get the entire object here with the method and the property. So this is how the context inside an arrow function works. It will always pick the value of this keyword from its enclosing context. Yeah, that basically sums up how this works in JavaScript. You can clearly see that it's not just a reference to a class instance like it is in case of some other object-oriented programming language like Java. It is way more than that when it comes to JavaScript, and it certainly is a lot more confusing. In the next video, we'll take a look at how you can run a function with a different this value using the dreaded call, apply and bind methods. So before watching that, make sure you understand what exactly this keyword is. So do watch this video carefully. And if you have any doubts or suggestions, you can put them in the comments. Yeah, I'll see you in the next one.